there just seems to be a deeper hunger. There seems to be stories that used to be few and far between becoming very regular. There's young people turning up to churches like we haven't seen in many years. And especially in Canada, where we have some very secular, very much post-Christian, arguably pre-Christian kind of, cities. It's like there's people from all over the world now who've never been exposed to the gospel starting to meet Jesus.
Welcome to the Innovative Church Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Bryant. In every episode, we bring in guests who will inspire, encourage you to be more effective in your mission field. On today's episode of the Innovative Church Leaders Podcast, I have with me Josh Thompson from the Pastorate. How are you, Josh?
I'm doing great, Eric. It's good to be with you.
Yeah, I stumbled across your ministry, the Pastorate.ca. You guys are a ministry in Canada really trying to address the pastoral crisis your country's facing. I think is probably true in many spots in the Western world. But talk for a little bit about that crisis. What kind of motivated the beginnings of this ministry?
Yeah, for us, our ministry really started coming out of COVID. There was a need that we saw for many years in our country for pastors, especially younger pastors, to be invested in, to be cared for, to be given a vision of what good, faithful pastoring could look like. And what we started to see in kind of the early 2010s and then into the time of COVID was just so many pastors burning out, becoming disillusioned, discouraged in the work, finding other types of vocations more compelling. And our founder, Jason, who was a part of Alpha and the Youth Alpha series for many years, he spent a lot of time going around the country, connecting with different churches, youth ministries. And what he just began to notice over time was just the need for something to serve pastors in our country. There's so many great ministries that do work around mission or evangelism or leadership development. There's seminaries. There's all these different parts of the Christian ecosystem, which are so important. But we felt like there was maybe a bit of a need, a bit of a gap in Canada for pastors specifically to be spoken to and encouraged. And then even in Canada, we're such a big country, but we're really spread out. And so how do we connect pastors to a sense of what God's doing in our country with each other, cheer each other on the work? And so, that's really where our origins came from. And one of the stats that most kind of gripped us in the early days was a conversation with the denominational leader who mentioned that for every 7 pastors they had retiring in the next 5 to 10 years, they only had one pastor under the age of 45 in their denomination. And that number is different, probably in different circles. But what we noticed was just this real need for young pastors to be brought into the pipeline, to stay in the work for decades to come and to be fruitful in what they're doing, to be effective in that ministry. And so that's the heart of our team at the Pastorate.
Yeah, I love this phrase. Together we're building the church of tomorrow. Today, this idea of strengthening the heart, the skill, the vision of pastors. What are some of the ways you're investing in pastors there in Canada to help improve their morale, their sense of longevity? What are some of the things you're doing to invest in pastors?
Yeah, well, we've done a number of things over the years. Like I said, we kind of started in a time where there's a lot of lockdowns, a lot of things going on where we couldn't gather. We couldn't do maybe some of the traditional conferences, retreats, ways to connect pastors in the room. So we started this podcast and we started, under the name the Canadian Church Leaders Podcast. And we just wanted to share both the voices of local Canadian pastors, which sometimes in Canada we don't hear as often. And then we also wanted to bring in thought leaders from all over the globe to speak to the themes of pastoral leadership and leading churches and navigating both the internal world of yourself as you lead, as well as the world of your ministry. And so we started this podcast and we quickly realized there was such a kind of deep need and appreciation for something that felt for Canadian pastors from Canadian pastors. As well as, in Canada, we're such a spread out country. There's all these small communities in northern areas or coastal towns and kind of the rural prairies. And just this invitation for pastors to be a part of a bigger story of what God's doing in our country. And we get these emails where pastors would go, I just feel so seen. I feel heard, especially for younger pastors. Sometimes if they're in these more remote places, they might be the only pastor under 60, for miles. And so for them to even feel like, I'm getting to listen, almost have a conversation with some other peers in ministry, that just was really meaningful for a lot of them. So we've leaned into this podcast thing, really effective tool as well, just cost-wise for us to try and impact as many pastors as we can in our country in an affordable way. And so that's been a great tool, just cheerleading, talking about the themes, the felt needs of pastors, sharing stories of God working in our country. And then also over the years, we've, added more things. So we've done, different gatherings, retreats for pastors, getting their spouses and them away, just having times of refreshment and building friendship. That's a huge part of our ministries. We want pastors to have good, meaningful friendships with others. And we've really tried to hone kind of the craft of how do you set the table, bring pastors together, let them bring their guards down and just open up to each other and build that sense of trust and let them have some fun together, feel refreshed in the work they're doing. We love to just express gratitude to them, say, hey, thanks so much for what you're doing. It really matters. Sometimes they just need to hear that. And then also we've done some really intentional programs over the years. And so we have two right now. One's called the Lead Pastor Fellowship. One's called our Emerging Leaders Lab. And each of them is really focused on going deep over the course of about a year to a year and a half with a smaller group of about 15 to 25 pastors and saying, hey, what would it look like to make a deep investment into these pastors with the hope of like setting some track about what lifelong ministry could look like for them. For the younger group, it's often how do we kind of like set the stage for health in a lot of different areas of character and calling and craft, your context, all these different things. And for the lead pastors, it's really about connecting them with each other, strengthening their community of pastors, helping them maybe connect with some different streams of the church, like learning from people, brothers and sisters in different contexts, and helping them feel like they can go the distance together. So that's the work that we've been up to. We want to seed hope. We want to give them a great vision. We want to encourage them in the work they're doing.
I love it. Yeah, I'm part of a group of pastors here in South Austin, and we have guys starting out in their 20s that are church planters. We've got a guy who was a church planter in his 70s, just this wide gamut of ages and experience. And it's really beautiful to be able to just talk about what's really happening in our life, not worrying if they're going to leave our church if we say something wrong, or, just kind of being able to really vent and share our hearts. I love that you've created that space for pastors in Canada. What's really encouraging too is there's another reason this crisis is so important is there's a lot of interest. There's kind of a renewal that's bubbling up in Canada. Talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's really exciting, and it's also feels like early days. So it's hard to always know exactly what's happening. But I think we've heard, I'll steal Mark Sayers' term of spot fires. There's this sense of like in the UK, in the US, some of this is linked to Asbury. In Canada, we felt some of it too, where it's like, there just seems to be a deeper hunger. There seems to be stories that used to be few and far between becoming very regular. There's young people turning up to churches like we haven't seen in many years. And especially in Canada, where we have some very secular, very much post-Christian, arguably pre-Christian kind of, cities. It's like there's people from all over the world now who've never been exposed to the gospel starting to meet Jesus. And so we see this need of like, there's been declining church engagement and pastors leaving the ministry for years. But then also now there's this turn of, man, there's all these young people coming to know the Lord, and they're hungry to have good teaching and to be a part of healthy church communities. And at the same time, we've had, churches going down in some places. And so it's like, how do we now raise up more pastors for what God might be doing both now and then in the years to come? And we want to be ready to disciple whatever kind of harvest he brings. And we want people to have amazing churches all over the country that they can be a part of. And so that's what we're trying to do. There's so many good ministries working on that. We're trying to do our small part. But yeah, it's a real passion for us.
That's really beautiful. I'd love to hear from your own vantage point or from stories from other pastors in Canada. What are some of the questions that these skeptics who are turning into new believers have been asking, and how are you answering them? That's what's pulling them towards Jesus.
I mean, I think a lot of this is, we can look to the work of Charles Taylor and James K. Smith and some of the contemporaries who've been speaking about this more recently. And it's like the sense of disillusionment with the secular age, a sense of like maybe broken promises, things aren't working. The stories that people have lived into just aren't fulfilling. And so I think a lot of young people, what we've been hearing from church leaders is a lot of young people are showing up just going like, I don't know if I agree with all this, if I like all this, if I believe all this, but my sense is that something's not working about the alternative, storylines and worldviews. So for a lot of people, it's like low biblical literacy or understanding, but like high openness to what it might, be about. People are compelled by, of course, the person of Jesus, and we're also seeing like, in lots of different contexts, there's like this kind of openness to the miraculous and God showing up in different ways, like stories of that you'd often hear about maybe from more of like a missions context. We're now seeing on home soil a little bit more, like people talking about, I had someone show up to me in a dream, tell me I'm supposed to go to this church, or showing up to churches being like, I don't even know why I'm here, but I feel like I'm supposed to.
Yeah.
So for a lot of pastors, it's trying to figure out like, oh, how do we respond to that now? Because that's a different journey of discipleship than they used to have. And so even for us in our work, it's like connecting pastors with each other to be processing these learnings as they're working on it together. It's just really important work.
Yeah. Well, and what were some of the things that you say, perhaps on your podcast or at the gatherings or cohorts, that helps prepare pastors for renewal personally, in order to be ready for a renewal perhaps that comes across the country?
Yeah. I mean, we're so focused on pastoral health. Like we just want pastors in their own walk with the Lord. Like we want them to, of course, be abiding in Jesus deeply in their own personal life. And then as they do ministry, we just want to help name the different temptations and off ramps and areas where there could just be challenges that will come. And so, for example, like, I mean, a ton of this would be grabbing from people like Pete Scazzaro and his work with emotionally healthy leadership and other places where it's like pastors just uniquely navigate some really complex things when it comes to their work, their family, their faith, their church environment, how it all overlaps. And so we'll talk, for example, in our programs with pastors about the challenges of like dual relationships. Like how do you navigate potentially a good, close friend being in your church and then also kind of like being their pastor, and those hats are tough to wear. And as you receive criticism from people who are in your church, but also you'd call a friend, that's a weird dynamic. Like most of us don't criticize our friends for their work.
Yeah.
They're just our friends. So we try and help pastors just recognize that's going to be part of the gig. And how do you navigate it? How do you give it to the Lord? How do you have the right like ecosystem of support around you, whether it's, your spouses, other lead pastors who get it. Like we often will joke about that idea of, when you sit down with another pastor, you can just kind of go like, yeah, I got that Monday morning email about my sermon.
Yeah.
Like pastors just get it. They know what that's like. So a sense of just shared journey together really helps pastors, and then try to give them some tools to do the work, like whether it's books and resources, or we bring in a lot of voices to our programs to speak to some of those people who've done the work for many years and done it with joy. They still love Jesus. Their marriages and their families are still healthy. And we try and lift up those examples of like, there's lots of different ways people kind of end ministry and different levels maybe of notoriety or what some might call success. And we want to go, hey, this is what it looks like to be faithful, filled with joy, to have built meaningful relationships throughout your life. And we want pastors to aspire to that.
I love that. And I think it's great. You guys are creating the space for these pastors to really figure out the schemes of the enemy. What are the ways he comes after you so that you can guard against it? And then certainly, having healthy rhythms in your own life and own walk. Maybe if there's a story or two you have of a pastor that came into one of your gatherings or a cohort that was on the edge of burnout, what were some of the steps you saw towards healing in his or her heart?
Yeah, I mean, we have so many meaningful ones that, it's amazing to see what God's done over the years. Like we had this one guy in one of our first programs. His name is John, out on the east coast of Canada, and it was on this small island that like there was only, I think, like 10,000 people on this whole island, and it was like a ferry ride away from the mainland, and then multiple hour drive to the closest city, just like a very remote kind of setting. And he came in just feeling overwhelmed, both personally and then also for his family, of just all the demands of ministry. He'd been in a church before where he felt maybe a bit, pressured to be a certain type of pastor, doing a certain way, to have a certain level of like growth or impact that he just didn't feel maybe aligned with his gifts. And he came into the program pretty like close to kind of just calling it quits. And I think for him, and we've seen this with a number of pastors, there could be this feeling of like, well, I'm not the right fit, or like I don't look the part. I don't have what it takes to be this type of pastor. And for him, as he did this program with us for 2 years, he just started to see the way that God called him and his specific wiring and gifting to a specific place for a time to lead and do ministry in a certain way that he was wired for. And in some ways, it was just a reordering, I think, of like, what's the win, or like, what does good, faithful ministry look like? Because it's going to look different in different settings and contexts.
Yeah.
So for him, I think too, journeying with some others, get to process life and ministry with other lead pastors and like safe people. I think that's been a really cool part of our programs, is especially for some younger leaders, it's like your pastor is also your boss, and that's a tricky dynamic when you're trying to figure out like maybe a sense of calling, or how do I navigate this tricky situation, or I'm going through this thing personally in my family, and who do you talk to? And sometimes, again, that like boss pastor dynamic can be tough. And so having like another peer or maybe a mentor that's kind of outside your context, a bit of a third party removed from your local setting, can just really help them, with wisdom, process what to do next. So that's one of them. And so John, now he's thriving. His church is amazing.
That's great.
His wife is really like come from a place of almost like resenting ministry and him doing it, to like doing it with him with joy. And they've got little kids that are just amazing, and they're all part of the church, and just, they're doing well. There's real health that's come. And so we love to see that. And another guy that I can bring up who did one of our programs, he recently answered the call to go up to a small city called Yellowknife. And that's like way up north in Canada. Like if you look at the map of Canada, like it's up there, and very remote, and not an easy place to go. And the story of his denomination was that they had 9 churches in this area, and none of them had lead pastors anymore. And so he was at this like district conference, heard about this, and went, man, like maybe I need to go. And he was in a big, great church in a big city in Calgary, no reason to move, young kids, but he just felt like, oh man, someone's got to go and pastor some of these churches. And so he answered the call, moved his family up there, and then he actually re-enrolled in another one of our programs, because he just said, like, I recognize this move, I'm going to lose a lot of my network, a lot of my friends in ministry, but I want to stay tethered to other friends in ministry. And I think it's been really beneficial as he's done that move and navigated all the challenges of like church renewal and the remoteness of where he is now. And, coming into a place that hadn't had a lead pastor for a number of years. And so we're so thankful that he would do that work. And it feels like, just like such a stamp of approval from him that he would go like, oh, I'm going to do another one of these programs with these guys because it's helped so much. And so we love to hear stories like that.
Yeah. Well, obviously, as you're combating the loneliness, the weariness, the confusion that pastors have, I would love for you just to maybe end with a little bit of hope for a pastor or a church leader that's listening, and they want that renewal, they want that personal momentum. What sort of encouragement would you share with them today?
Yeah, we often talk with our pastors about like the vocation that you're called to is hard, but it's really holy work. Like Jesus is in this with you. Like the work you're doing, the criticism that you might face, the sense of tiredness that you'll go through at times, like Jesus is with you, and he's got his church. We have this old guy who's a part of our team, Daryl, and he often talks about like Jesus is building his church. Like he's got it, like he's doing it. And all around us, there's stories of, Jesus is still working people's lives. And so I think for a lot of pastors, for us to just be reminded that like the work we do is really important. And like Jesus is also doing okay. He's building his church. He's calling people to himself. And also like just to keep our eyes on the right things. Like if you pastor in a small church for your whole life, that's amazing. God's using you to touch people's lives. You get to shepherd them and bring the truths of his gospel into their worlds. It's so meaningful. And I think a lot of pastors have maybe been discouraged, feeling like they need to do some sort of ministry in a certain way or have some sort of success by someone else's terms. And we just want to call pastors to be reminded that Jesus sees them, is thankful for the work they're doing, that it really matters. There's other pastors going through it too. But yeah, the work that we're doing, it's really important. So.
Thank you so much, Josh. I appreciate the encouragement and the work you're doing there with pastors in Canada at the Pastorate.ca. Thanks so much, Josh.
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us for the Innovative Church Leaders Podcast. Go to my website, ericbryant.org, for my newsletter and free resources.